So, in our last lecture, the first lecture of this summer class, we went from basically 1491 to the late 17th century, that is the late 1600s, right? And we talked about patterns of English colonization and Spanish and French and Dutch. And we're going to fast forward a little bit because, as far as we are concerned here with US history, things start getting good in about the mid 18th century, that is the 1700s and in the 1750s. Things start becoming, we kind of start moving in a direction that will eventually lead to the revolution. So let's look briefly here at a map of North America in 1750. You see, obviously, we know about the 13 colonies. France is, as I mentioned in the last lecture, Quebec is the first French fort, and then they explore the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, up the Missouri. So you see why France would have had this kind of pattern of colonization all the way from New Orleans to the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River, and then all the way out to effectively the edge of the Rocky Mountains. Spain we know about, right? Columbus starts out here. The Spanish move into Mexico, what is then New Spain. There's small British claims in the Caribbean. Obviously, Jamaica, we know. Potentially Belize is another country that has a history of British colonization. And then this kind of in-between area here, and then the British stuff up here. So that is 1750. This is before the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War is one of a series of wars, basically between France and England. All of the other wars, King Anne's War, or Queen Anne's War, King George's War, there's all these various wars in the decades up to the 7 Years' War. They all start in Europe, and they're fought largely in Europe. This is different in that it actually starts in the Americas with the French and Indians allied against the English, and the English attacking French and Indian forces. And that's what, if it's European history, we talk about the 7 Years' War. If it's American history, we often refer to the French and Indian War, which kind of kicks the whole thing off. Again, starts in North America. You'll see who actually starts it. It's someone who will be relevant later in American history. Britain and Prussia, basically parts of Germany and Poland. Also, Portugal is on this side, versus France, Spain, Austria, and Russia. So it is, in some sense, a kind of world war, especially considering with colonization, you see how not only in the Americas, but in West and East Africa and South Asia, all of these colonies are really spread out throughout the world. It is an American style of warfare. So it's not like, you can imagine in your mind the European style of warfare, people lined up in neat rows, blasting musket fire at each other. The first row of people fall down and are dead or wounded, and then the people behind them, right, take over, shoot. So, and then the basically like a chess match, you want to move your forces in a way where you can outflank the other general, and that's how it's basically fought. That's not how this conflict was fought. It is kind of guerrilla warfare. That's guerrilla with a U, not with an O. And it is irregular forces. It is people sneaking up. This was considered a kind of Native American style of attack, ambush, except with the European weapons. Okay, so how does this thing pop off here? George Washington actually starts it. He is sent into the Ohio River Valley, which is north of Virginia in what is now obviously southeastern Ohio, to secure the rights to British claims. Not really, this is rather rich in the sense that it was French land, but the British said they wanted it. They said they had rights to it, and Washington is sent to secure them. Virginians, some of his troops fire upon French troops. The conflict doesn't last long. They're captured pretty quickly. But this basically is the beginning of the French and Indian War. Obviously, George Washington will come back later to command U.S. forces in the Revolutionary War, but this is the first time we see him in action here. Okay, so the British need to have people volunteering to fight. It's going to be very difficult for the British to get all their troops over from England to the Americas, and also to fight in a European theater of war and an American theater of war. So they need more American colonists to join up. Enter the Albany Congress. You probably have seen this image in the background, the famous Join or Die image. It was published by Benjamin Franklin, not for the Revolution, but for getting colonies together to fight in the French and Indian War. And we'll have a little activity based on this primary source in class. But suffice it to say, it was an image that was published in order to get people to join in on the Albany Congress, which was to get British colonists to join in the defense against France, right? Basically get colonists to volunteer to get trained up and to fight against the French. Franklin has an ulterior motive here. So he says, sure, the British want volunteers to fight against the French, but I have my own plan. And as many of his colleagues would have, they wanted more autonomy and more self-rule, more say over what gets done. So Franklin says, okay, the British are going to get their troops. We're going to get our autonomy. Let's do this thing. Let's have this Albany Congress. It is successful in the former goal. It does get people to volunteer. It is not successful in the latter goal of moving towards more home rule. I will point out here, 7 of the 13 colonies show. So not all the colonies even show up to the Albany Congress. And keep a mental pin here on the 7 of 13 to the Albany Congress, because it's going to be relevant as we move forward in the next decade or so to see how that, really 2 decades, how that colonial unity grows from 7 of 13 to eventually, obviously, 13 of 13. Okay, so they fight a war, bing, bing, boom, boom. 1763, it's over. It is the Treaty of Paris, the Peace of Paris. Don't get the Peace of Paris, as I just briefly did. Don't get the Peace of Paris confused with the Treaty of Paris. The Peace of Paris in 1763 ends the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris, we will learn about later, that ends the Revolutionary War. Okay, so England wins. They get all the French lands in New France. That, is a bummer for the French. Again, if we kind of go back and look here, that's like a lot, right? That's like a lot of territory here, basically. There's a little caveat here with the stuff west of the Mississippi, which I'll get to right now. France loses land all over the world. Really, in the end, it is a big loss for France. However, does it change things, quote unquote, on the ground, as it were? Not really, right? The French trappers and traders are still going. They're still interacting with Native Americans. Native Americans, they don't care about some treaty that is signed, 1,000 some miles away. But it will affect their lives significantly. Spain loses Florida. So England gets Florida, but as a kind of concession, they give, because basically what England wants is they want a contiguous land. So again, let's go back to 1750, right? So, England wins. Spain is on the losing side. So they effectively could claim a lot of Spanish territory, but the British don't want to go to war again now with Spain. So they strike a deal. They say, look, we want to have a contiguous, right, or all connected landmass. So give us Florida, and in exchange, we will give you the land west of the Mississippi. What do they care? As far as the British are concerned, that's no man's land. And then, so here's what the map looks like in 1763, right? The French are effectively gone. They're here in Saint-Domingue or Haiti for the time being. There's going to be a revolution there as well, but that doesn't come till later. And the British have everything else, right? A lot of territory, all the way up to the Mississippi, all up moving through what was formerly French land up into the Hudson Bay. So what are the immediate effects? Obviously, this is a big deal for Britain's prestige, winning this battle against the French and its allies. However, war ain't cheap, and it costs a lot of money. And of course, no nation just has a bunch of money sitting around in a treasury or something. They have to take out loans. They have to take out, go into debt effectively to finance this thing. That's a problem. The British soldiers, the military, the officials who came over to train the British colonists, see them really as rubes, as provincial, hillbillies. They're unwilling or unable to train. They couldn't, imagine the continental style of warfare, all in a neat straight line, moving in unison, marching with precision. The colonists just aren't good at this. So they see the colonists as kind of, backwater hillbillies. Obviously, this is going to be relevant, right? So this kind of antagonism between the British military and the British colonial military is going to be relevant later. What are the effects on colonial Americans? It unites them, right? So this is, again, not every colony is joining in here, but a lot of colonies and a lot of colonists are joining in, and it unites them against a common enemy in the French, right? That they start to see themselves as one kind of group. They, unlike the British who saw them as hillbillies, they see the British as being out of touch, right? That these techniques don't work. Who cares if you have shiny buttons and you can march in a straight line? That doesn't win a war. What wins a war is being able to, sneak through the woods undetected, to spy, to orchestrate an ambush that's successful, all of that kind of stuff. And then lastly, as I said, the British begin to see themselves as a unified thing. This often happens when you have disparate groups of people fighting a common enemy. They suddenly come together, and any conflicts or issues they had between each other before suddenly are erased in the face of a larger enemy. What happens to the Native Americans? They lose their French allies. They can no longer kind of play the middle ground between the British and the French. That British are really the only game in town. Well, again, as I said, it doesn't affect things, for the everyday Native American out in the middle of, the, say, Michigan or the Midwest. But with respect to big picture things, tribal chiefs can no longer negotiate with both the French and the British, right? It's just the British. And then, of course, with the French gone, with no one there to protect them, the English colonists begin to pour over the Appalachian Mountains, which are, let's see if we can find a map just in case. Well, here, basically where this red line is, right? The Appalachian Mountains come down here, right through North Carolina, what is now West Virginia, up into Pennsylvania. And that red line is the Proclamation Line of 1763. We'll learn about that in 1 second. Okay, so they're pouring over the mountains, expropriating, as I said, again, forcefully taking land, because they think, guys, it's the free-for-all now, right? We go over there, kill the natives, take the land, and get good farmland. Natives say not so fast. Chief Pontiac, who is an Ottawa chief, gathers a bunch of other tribes up in what is right now, this is Michigan, this is Canada, Ohio. They get together and they kill a lot of people. 2,000 soldiers and settlers killed in a pretty short amount of time. They attack all of the various forts, which are now, some of these were formerly French forts. Now they're all British. Attack the forts, attack settlers. The British send in lot of forces, and the rebellion is quickly put down. But what it shows the British is that this is a problem. They can't have the colonists flooding over and attacking Native Americans, because either A, they're going to have more uprisings like this, and it's going to be a huge drain on their military resources, or B, the French are going to go back to war. The Indians are going to petition the French saying, help us, you've abandoned us, please come back, and they're going to have another war on their hands. So what do? They create the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is right here, right? Get this thing out of here. Oh, sorry. So the proclamation line. So it says that colonists cannot cross this line, and anyone actually on the other side, they forcibly remove from that territory, move them back. So the idea is this is going to eliminate the threat from Native Americans. It's going to cool down relations between natives and the colonists, and it's going to keep them away from another war with the French. Americans don't like it. The term would have been throttling their liberties. That they have this is their right. They have the right to go over and take this land and kill these Native Americans. And who are the British to force them to? I mean, they beat the French after all, right? I mean, so the thinking of the colonists is, look, we beat the French. What's the point if we can't go over there and settle this land? Land is becoming increasingly expensive and more rare across the on this side of the line. So that's what they want. Obviously, this is going to be relevant for history later. Okay, so the thinking is the colonies need to pay their fair share, right? This war was started in the colonies, it was fought largely in the colonies, and it was won so that the colonists could be free of French and Native American aggression, and you got what you wanted, so they should pay their fair share of the debt, right? It's not people in Leicester or Wales who primarily benefit from this victory. It's people in the colony. So why shouldn't they pay up? Colonists are not going to like this, right? They're not going to like this idea that they have to shoulder the burden of taxes to pay off these debts. What effectively one of the things that the British do in order to recoup some the debt that they incurred during the war is not just to tax the colonies, but to end the period that we learned about in the last lecture that was known as salutary neglect. Remember that mercantilism is the name of the game in 18th century economy and trade. And a lot of the laws that govern mercantilism for the British, these are called the Navigation Acts, are not being enforced because it's too difficult to enforce. So effectively, the British have been hemorrhaging money for 100 years plus. And now they say no more of that. We're going to end this period of salutary neglect. We're going to start enforcing the mercantilist trade policies, and we're going to get our money back, right? And this, again, happens after the 7 Years' War. This is initiated by the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. Remember, the Prime Minister and the King are different things. The King is obviously the King. You know what a king or a queen is. Because Britain is a parliamentary democracy, or it's a parliamentary monarchy. They also have a Prime Minister, which is basically like, for shorthand, is like the president. So you have a president and you have a king, right? You have a parliament and you have the kind of quote unquote president and you have the king. So Walpole is the Prime Minister when they end salutary neglect. The next important Prime Minister is George Grenville, and he is in charge when they pass the Sugar Act of 1764, which increases duties on sugar, foreign sugar. The colonists protest, the duties are lowered. So that's a win for the colonists, and it's also a win for their sense of protesting and pushing back and fighting back actually gets things done. The Quartering Act of 1765. So colonists are required to feed and house British soldiers. Again, the thinking is, look, we're sending hundreds and hundreds of troops from England to this far-flung colony. We're not going to build barracks in all these forts. People are just going to live with you all because they're there to protect you. They're there to protect the frontier against the French. They're also kind of there to protect the frontier against the British colonists, right? And this is something that the colonists see, right? Are they here to protect us or to keep us hemmed in? The Quartering Act is relevant also because you will see that when we look at the amendments, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, with almost all of them, we can trace them back to things that the colonists didn't like during this period, right? So the Third Amendment, you don't hear much about the Third Amendment. You hear about the First, you hear about the Second, but the Third Amendment bans the military, having to house military, right, in your private residence. And again, not a super controversial bill here, not like the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, but it's something that is born out of this Quartering Act of 1765. And same with the First Amendment is born out of colonial complaints against the British. The Second Amendment is born out of colonial complaints against the British. The Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth. So it's interesting in the next lecture when I talk about the Bill of Rights, it's interesting because a lot of times we in the modern world look at the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, as being somehow forward thinking. And they are, right, to no small degree. But they are also incredibly reactive in the sense that they're reacting against all of the crap that the British made the colonists do in the years, right, the decades before the war. The Stamp Act is the last major one. It's not a tax on stamps. It is a tax that requires all printed material, anything that's paper, really, from newspapers and magazines to playing cards, have to have a stamp on them that says they've paid this duty. This is the first direct tax on colonists. So that is to say, is a tax that an individual colonial subject, a person, would pay. When you go out and buy a newspaper and it's more money because it has a stamp, you pay that. Where the Sugar Act, for example, yeah, if you're a sugar importer or a sugar exporter or a refiner, you're not going to like this because it's going to be effectively like a tariff on your goods. But what are you going to do with that tax? You're going to roll it into the price of the sugar, and the sugar price is going to go up nominally. People might notice it, they might not. But it's not a direct tax on the consumer. And we can talk more about that in class if we'd like to. Okay, so the colonists don't like the way things are going, and they call another kind of get-together, right? Like if we go back here and remember the first one that is relevant to our history, the Albany Congress of 1754, colonists get together, they muster troops to fight the French, and they also want to have more home rule. 7 of 13 show up. So that's in 1754. By 1765, you have the Stamp Act Congress, which is in response to the Stamp Act, and 27 people from 9 of the colonies get together. So we've gone from 7 of 13 to 9 of 13. This is a good sign, right? They appeal to the king and parliament to repeal the act, which is basically ignored. They don't really do anything about it, right? James Otis, who's one of the prominent members of the Stamp Act Congress, says that there should be, quote, no taxation without representation. A phrase that is probably one of the most well-known phrases of the Revolutionary period, and is also surely the most misunderstood phrase. We have superimposed or projected onto this phrase a kind of, revolutionary fervor to break free of British rule. But if you look at and you think about this statement, there's nothing revolutionary about this at all, right? What does the statement, no taxation without representation, actually mean? It doesn't mean freedom. It doesn't mean liberty or death. It means we want to have representation in the British Parliament. And we don't want you to tax us unless we have representation in the British Parliament. So if anything, this phrase is not revolutionary. It's demanding that the colonists be considered even more British, right? They don't want to be independent. They don't think they're being treated as fully British. Right? They're not being treated as British enough. And it's a violation of their rights as British subjects to be relegated to this second-class status. So this is a really, really important concept. And it's something that, 9 people out of 10 on the street are going to get this one wrong when we say, well, what does it mean, right? No taxation without representation. What is the spirit of that phrase? People are going to get all revolutionary. Independence is absolutely not. There's nothing revolutionary about this statement. So again, I hope we can talk more about that too in class. Okay, so what does it come down to? How do the British justify what they're doing here? Well, they say that the colonists have virtual representation, right? So the colonists say, look, we don't have members of parliament, so we don't have real representation. No taxation without representation. The British say, well, no, you're British subjects, and the theory is, right, that the parliament acts in the best interest of all British subjects. So therefore, you are represented in Congress. The same way that, you all can't vote because you're not 18 yet. But the thinking is people in Congress are going to not going to do things that go against your best interests either. They're not going to pass some kind of, child slavery law or something like that. You are virtually represented in Congress. So that's the argument that the British make. Which side is correct? That's a debate that we can have, right? History would seem to suggest that the colonists were correct because the revolution happened and they won, and that then, democracy, at least globally, did spread, and it was a actual more direct form of democracy, not a kind of virtual representation. Okay, so what do the colonists do? They organize, they arrange non-importation agreements, they boycott British goods, right? Things like tea, things like cooking oils, all of this stuff. They work together to hurt the British economy. Boycott, they protest, they harass tax collectors, they impede the flow of money. This is actually interesting to be teaching this now in the time of like COVID-19 and people refusing to wear masks, right? Because it's their, freedom or whatever. This movement is one of volunteer, a major part of the American Revolution in terms of the major thrust of democracy was people voluntarily doing things that they thought was best for the body politic. So one of the interesting things when we learn later about like the Boston Tea Party and the boycotting of British tea, colonists were all for it, right? They did it together because they wanted to defeat this tax. And they were really violent. Like if people said, we're not going to do it, we're drinking tea, they get tarred and feathered, right? If they went against the kind of like social norms of what the demos, the people, the democracy was saying. And there's other, periods of sacrifice like that. World War I, World War II, where Americans are asked to voluntarily sacrifice things. So it's interesting to think, that, we're in effectively a different kind of time period now. Where in previous generations, the idea of sacrifice was what you did to be patriotic, where now that kind of sacrifice is seen as not patriotic, or I don't know what. I mean, again, it's interesting to tie these historical events into current events, and again, it's a discussion that would be enjoyable to have in class. Well, anyway, back to the 1760s, it works. The Stamp Act. The Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, but they pass something called the Declaratory Act, which is kind of like, okay, the colonists get a small victory, but the stage has been set for a larger conflict in that, yes, Stamp Act is repealed, but the Declaratory Act basically says Parliament has the right to declare these taxes. So, okay, we'll give you we'll take the mulligan on this one. But we're firing a shot across the bow and saying, but from here on out, we have the right to declare taxes on goods. That is the history of the years leading up to the real conflict. So from the French and Indian War in 1754 to 1766, with the Stamp Act being repealed and the Declaratory Acts, we have an increased notion of colonial unity, and we see increased tensions between British colonists and the Crown or Parliament. We also see the exit of the French in the Americas. That is all for this. I will continue with part 3 of this lecture, which will go over the Revolutionary period from the Declaratory Acts up to the Treaty of Paris, which ends the Revolutionary War in the early 1780s. Thank you.